Sailing into the Heart by Tana Jenkins. Copyright. First published by Bryant Street Shorts, 2021 copyright symbol, 2021 by Tana Jenkins. Second edition 2023 copyright Tana Jenkins. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. Chapter 1. Syndey. 8 pairs of eyes followed Syndey St. James as she raced alongside the old wooden prairie fence. "Mind the ranch," she called to them. 2 horses, 2 llamas, 2 goats, 1 big scruffy cat, and another not-so-big, not-so-scruffy dog took turns wagging their tails. Popcorn, her cream and white stallion, kicked up clouds of dust as he galloped apace on the other side of the fence, letting loose a high-pitched whinny when he came to the end of the pasture. She groaned at the gentle tug on her heart. She loved her motley crew, and normally Popcorn's whinny would be cause for her to turn around to dole out a few more pets to the gang. But today, she left them with a wave as they snorted and pawed at the dirt, gestures she interpreted as their own versions of safe travels. People in town referred to her remote little rescue farm as Noah's Ark, and she kind of liked the name. To her, the Ark represented a source of hope and salvation. She rarely ran short of hope, but who couldn't use a little saving from time to time? She sure could, especially now. Syndey was late. Again. Using her left hand, she pressed her lucky straw hat down on her head and pumped the pedals of her lime green second-hand bike so hard her thighs burned. But when a warm gust blew up from the lake, catching the wide brim, she surrendered with a sigh and re-gripped her bicycle's handlebars. The floppy hat whipped back, creating a kite only hooked in place by the bright orange scarf knotted under her chin. For a moment she wished she were a smaller, lighter version of herself, small enough and light enough to be whisked to her destination by a hat-sized kite. On the other side of the island, Henry, her shy, awkward assistant, waited with 7 eager birdwatchers who expected to be taken on an exquisite tour of the winged wild. The fact that Henry was waiting with the first group of the season was a curse and a blessing. On the one hand, at least they'd know their guide was on her way, but as much as she loved her faithful assistant, lately she worried about leaving him alone with the tourists. Most high school seniors experienced uneasiness as they approached graduation. It was even more pronounced for those on an island where graduation often inevitably meant leaving the small community they'd grown up in to seek out a living thousands of miles away. Some of the young people welcomed the change of scenery with open arms, but Henry wasn't one of them. His reaction was more akin to a baby bird being kicked out of a cliffside nest, alternately taciturn and excitable, rarely settled. The thought sent a hot little ball of anxiety rolling through Syndey's stomach. She really couldn't afford to overpromise and underdeliver today, and she wasn't off to a great start, being late and all. Brushing a windswept curl from her eyelashes, she stood to pedal harder, the wheels squeaking as they spun faster down the sleepy lane. Of all the mornings for Brown Sugar, her spirited coonhound, to catch a scent and bolt. If not for the Lilac Festival, Syndey would have let her girl enjoy her freedom. But with people everywhere this weekend, she worried encountering an unleashed dog in the woods might be an unwelcome surprise for the wrong person. Eventually, she found her girl, but it cost her a 12-minute delay. Well, she couldn't pedal any faster, or use her non-existent telepathy to conjure up good feelings between Henry and the group. Exhaling as she took in the winsome sound of waves crashing, she maneuvered her bike onto the island's main road, which, like all the others, didn't allow cars. Then she veered off onto a narrow lane that led to the top of a small hill, housing many of the town's bed and breakfasts. Loaded with sweet country charm, the inns boasted lemonade porches made for rocking chairs and afternoon tea. Once May hit, The townspeople celebrated the end of the long, harsh winter by stringing buckets and buckets of assorted flowers everywhere. Colorful arrangements lined stairs, walkways, windows. Anywhere a basket fit, flowers were hung. Her favorite aspect of the road was its elevated views of Lake Huron. The water, which seemed to stretch on forever, was beautiful from the shore and breathtaking from the top of the hill. Today, the turquoise waters were full of early morning sailboats coasting in the channel between the island and the mainland. Carless Mackinac Island, Michigan, wasn't for everyone, but it was perfect for her. Bringing her bike to rest at the end of a dirt path, she hopped off, laying it down between two tall forsythia bushes and a thick cluster of wild daisies. She couldn't resist the daisy with the bent petals and tucked it into the rim of her hat before grabbing her backpack from the bike basket and racing up the path. About 100 feet in, her stomach tensed anew when she spotted Henry chatting with the small group. He gave her a short wave as she drew near. "Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm late. I'll make it up by extending the tour if that's all right with folks," Syndey said between breaths as she joined the group. "Are you late? I don't think we'd noticed," one of the women answered, glancing at everyone. "Your assistant was regaling us with the most charming tales about growing up on this lovely island." One part shocked, one part relieved, Syndey shot Henry a grateful glance, which he answered with a shy smile. "Yes, it is beautiful, and we can't wait to give you the insider's track on that beauty," Syndey said, finally feeling some of her natural cheerfulness return. The group of 7 responded with smiling nods and quick introductions, all eager to get started. Together they set off, hiking deeper into the forest, toward a strong, peaty smell that grew more pronounced with each step. 10 minutes later, they stopped at the edge of the great marsh. Surrounded by ferns, white birch, and quaking aspens, the area was a favorite with the brilliant blue indigo buntings. Meadowlarks and kingfishers also liked it there. If they were lucky, the group might even glimpse a bald eagle or a Kirtland's warbler. A quiet thrill coursed through Syndey as she surveyed the surrounding forest, and a thought took root. It had been 3 days since the last rainfall. That was abnormal for the island this time of year, but perfect weather for an eagle sighting. The dry conditions made foraging even harder, sending the beautiful birds farther and farther from their nests, increasing their visibility. No promises, but bald eagles have been spotted here. "Oh, I've never seen a bald eagle, but Richard and I were in the Bahamas last winter and we saw a warbler. It was the most beautiful thing. When the guide found out we were from the Midwest, he was positively green with envy, told us to come to Mackinac to see the warbler because it only breeds here and it's nearly extinct. Have you ever been to the Bahamas, Syndey?" "We should really try to keep our voices down. The birds have excellent hearing. We wouldn't want to scare them off," Syndey whispered politely. The woman repeated her question in a somewhat lower voice. A small sigh crept over Syndey's lips. Questions like these were her least favorite aspect of leading the tours. Why did people always assume that travel was everyone else's bailiwick? It wasn't. Some of her wealthier clientele spoke about their trips as if travel was the singular mark of sophistication. She cringed at the uncharitable thought, an overreaction to an innocent question. Big Mama would have said she was spraying stinkin' thinking like an angry lil skunk. It wasn't Mrs. Winter's fault that Syndey St. James hadn't been to the Bahamas or even left the island in the last 5 years. "No, ma'am, I've never been," she said at last. "What about Mexico? There's lots of great birding there, too. Have you ever been there?" Syndey shook her head. "Oh, but you must go. The land and the people are absolutely beautiful. The indigenous influence makes for a whole different kind of culture. There must be a special kind of magic in planes. People boarded them and suddenly had new appreciation for things already available to them before takeoff." Smiling, she remembered old Nate's words. Birds feed their young by sticking their beaks in their mouths. If you don't want to stick your beak in another person's mouth, then don't try to feed them. It wouldn't do to correct a guest by reminding her that indigenous influence was here in Michigan, too. Mrs. Winter's attention turned to Henry. "And what about you, young man? What got you interested in birding?" For someone who had been birding all over the world, Mrs. Winters seemed to have no care for birding etiquette. If left unchecked, this woman was going to single-handedly scare away the entire local population with her incessant chatter. Reluctantly, Henry answered, "Well, I suppose it was my teacher here, Miss St. James." He shrugged a bony shoulder at Syndey, and she winked back. "Oh, how delightful," the woman said. "So you're still in school, then?" She started fanning herself with her birding field guide. "Just graduated." Syndey felt her chest stiffen. This noisy conversation had the potential to go dark, quick. "And what will you do upon graduation?" Sydney's tension turned to surprise when Henry's cheeks brightened. She hadn't seen him look this happy in months and was suddenly grateful for the woman's questions. "I'm going to BBA. It's the local sailboat building school." So he'd been accepted. She wanted to bounce on her toes and clap her hands in celebration. For the umpteenth time in her 5-year teaching career, she said a silent thanks to Old Nate for starting this school. An Ojibwe born on the island, Old Nate had turned his First Nations canoe-building tradition into a sailboat-building school that gave boys like Henry an opportunity to stay home by learning a craft that could lead to a decent salary without having to rely on the seasonal tourist industry. "I'm so proud of you," she mouthed to him, and his smile widened. This news definitely called for celebration. Syndey made a mental note to take Henry to Kingston's cafe next week. Just then, Syndey heard a familiar sound. "Shh, did you hear that?" Smiling, she held up her hand. The group immediately fell silent, lifting their binoculars all at once as a collective buzz of anticipation hummed in the air. The leaves whispered, and Syndey willed everyone to tune out the various forest sounds in order to zero in on the bird song. One call, in particular, stood out for her. A series of loud chirps dancing through the air, not plaintive, not shrill, which meant they were the contact whistles of one bird searching for another. What is it, my child?" Mrs. Bannister was straining, leaning close to her husband, whose eyes were darting from branch to branch, seemingly frustrated with his binoculars. "Eagle. In the tree," Syndey whispered, pointing to a squat tree in the middle of the bog. "On the left, second branch from the top." The sun-bleached wood around it camouflaged the eagle's white head, and its wings blended in with the sun-dappled leaves. Syndey looked from the group to the branch. She could tell from their expressions, a blend of curiosity and frustration, that none of them saw the majestic bird. Her nerves tightened. Many of the people who signed up for her tours were happy if they saw anything, but this was a more experienced group, and seeing an eagle would mean a lot to them. It could also help reviews. "Which tree, darling? The forest is filled with them." Grace Hunt had a dry sense of humor that made Syndey chuckle. She also had a point. "That one, right there in the middle of the bog." But before anyone could see anything, a deep baritone bark shattered the morning quiet of the forest. Syndey's shoulders turned to steel. The majestic eagle took flight, a whir of white and brown feathers windmilling into the distance, and a thin hare with desperate eyes came darting out of the woods, cutting straight through the group of birders. A brown ball of loping fur that looked like a mid-sized bear trailed hot on the hare's heels. Only as it got closer did Syndey realize it wasn't a bear, but a huge dog, one with the speed and determination of a derailed locomotive. It had trampled a small tree in its effort to seize the terrified hare in what looked like 2-inch-long canines. "A wolf!" one woman screamed. Her panic set off a chain of equally frantic calls from everyone else in the group as they all scrambled to jump out of the animal's path of destruction. The hare darted to the edge of the bog and sprang toward the dark, algae-covered water. Landing first on a partially submerged tree stump, its paws barely touched the surface before the hare leaped to a boulder. Trailing close, the clumsy dog dove into the swamp with the confidence of an Olympic diver and the agility of a drunken sailor. Torn between laughing and crying, Syndey shook her head at the sudden chaos. "Silly dog, don't you know there's no catching Machabo?" The dog emerged quickly, his brown eyes as round as the boulder the hare had just evacuated. He pedaled around in circles, each stroke bringing him farther and farther from shore. Syndey knew the bog intimately from her childhood days in camp. Old Nate, then her instructor, had made them do bog walks as part of his Get in Touch with Nature curriculum. The bottom dropped off quickly. There was no chance the dog's hind legs were touching the silt beneath. It only took a few enthusiastic strokes before he seemed to realize the same. When his head went under once, then twice, and he came up spitting and howling, it was clear that this big oaf was the rare breed of canine that didn't know how to swim. Her amusement turned to alarm, and as thoughtlessly as the dog who'd preceded her, she dove into the cold, swampy water, surfacing with a gasp. It was freezing. Her limbs felt like ice. She lifted one hand, then the other, swimming quickly to the bobbing animal and wrapping her arms around him. The scared pup pawed at the water and her, seemingly shocked at its give. "It's okay. I got you. It's okay," she whispered, treading water until he calmed enough to allow her to swim back to shore. As soon as his forepaws touched solid earth, the dog shook his coat, eliciting a collective groan from all as slimy green swamp goo sprayed the group. She cringed. So much for first impressions. Tired from struggling to swim with the dog and covered in algae, she looked and felt like Gumby. What a disaster! Spotting his arched back, she grabbed him by the collar just as he prepared for a second round of shaking. "Gus! There you are!" a man's deep voice called. It was filled with equal parts relief and admonition. Gus promptly tucked his tail between his legs and pawed at the muddy shore. His owner, a tall, muscular man in aviators and a straw bucket hat with a thick green and red Gucci band, strode out of the woods like he owned them. He took one look at the grime-covered woman and the gape-mouthed group and erupted into the most raucous laughter Syndey had heard in ages. Her pulse skyrocketed. "Are you for real?" she said to the man who looked like he belonged on a rooftop patio bar instead of in the middle of a forest. The city boy was sporting leather wingtips, for God's sake. No wonder she had to be the one to jump in and save his silly dog. "Did your dark sunglasses make it so you couldn't see the signs in this area saying it's protected and dogs are not allowed? You and your dog just scared off a bald eagle. It might not ever come back. I hardly see the humor." She wanted to finish the sentence with "you moron," but thankfully the professional inside of her, waterlogged as she was, stopped her. It was enough that she had raised her voice in front of the group. She couldn't remember the last time she had gotten angry enough with anyone to do that. He held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "You're right." His rich, husky voice stroked her senses like warm sun, instantly uncoiling a bit of the tension in her shoulders. "You're absolutely right. I know better and should have done better." Taking off his sunglasses, he looked at the rest of the group with sincerity. "I'm very sorry that I interrupted your morning, ladies and gentlemen." He stepped forward, presumably to latch the leash in his hand through the silver loop on Gus's collar. "Come on, boy, we've caused enough trouble for one day. What did I tell you about trying to chase Machabo?" "Machabo?" She blinked in surprise. Few knew the myth of the great hare who married muskrat and fathered humanity. She only knew from old Nate's campfire stories. As the dog's owner stepped closer, Syndey stared, suddenly recognizing the brooding dark eyes and raven hair. The granite jaw and broad shoulders were new, the result of age and maturity, but those soulful eyes she'd know anywhere. "Devin?" she gasped. "Syndey?" His gaze skimmed her head to toe, and a smile quirked his full lips, a little crooked and a lot charming, just like it used to be. Their eyes locked, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them. Her mind reeled with questions, namely, what was he doing here? Her heart fluttered. then dropped. This trail was one that his grandfather, Old Nate, had shown them when they were kids. As sure as she knew her own name, she knew Devin was out walking it now in order to connect with the man he hadn't bothered to come visit in the 5 years leading up to his death. Chapter 2. Devin. Devin Fox stood rooted to the spot, his heart hammering a rhythm of surprise and nostalgia. He could hardly believe his eyes. The last person he expected to see when he came back to the island to pack up his deceased grandfather's house was a grown-up Syndey St. James. And what a sight the golden brown woman was. The skinny, mixed girl he used to explore the island with had been attractive when they were kids, but the stunning woman she'd turned into seemed to light up the dense forest around them. She belonged on television. Her dark brown eyes held a depth of experience he could only guess at, and her cascade of long curls was wild as the birds she'd been watching, and beautiful, even covered in flecks of green algae. He also couldn't help but notice how the waterlogged clothes she wore clung to her slender yet curvy figure. He latched the leash to Gus's collar, something he was kind of glad he hadn't done 20 minutes ago, all the while keeping his steady gaze on her. Looking away wouldn't have been possible if he'd tried, thanks in part to the wave of nostalgia washing over him. It had been 10 long years since he'd seen his first crush. They were probably about 15 or 16 then, and they hadn't ended on the best terms. Rather, he hadn't left things on the best terms. Yet being near her now was an instant pick-me-up. He'd been in a foul mood since arriving on the island late last night. His mother had offered to pack up the house, but Old Nate was Devin's paternal grandfather, and with Devin's father gone, the responsibility really was Devin's, even though they hadn't spoken for nearly 5 years, just enough time for him to forget how remote his grandfather's cabin was. When he arrived to no cell or internet service, he realized being cut off from his electronic distractions had a way of opening the door to all the painful memories he'd been trying to forget. Walking through the woods to clear his head, he'd wished he'd let his mother come instead. Not anymore. Seeing Syndey, those memories shifted and took on a different hue. The weight of the past felt less burdensome, replaced by a sense of curiosity about the woman standing before him. Gus whined, and Devin glanced down to scratch his back. As he did, he spotted a straw hat on the ground. The daisy in the brim told him it was hers. It had been her mother's favorite, and as kids, that was her trademark, the reason for her nickname. The corner of his mouth curved into a grin, and he shook his head. "Flower child." He stooped to pick it up. No doubt it had fallen as she dove in to save his dog. He handed it to her. "What are you doing here?" Her lips opened and closed. Before she could answer, a low moan broke the trance of their reunion. He swiveled his head to locate the source. An older woman with a shock of red hair, probably her natural color 30 years ago but now definitely courtesy of a bottle, sat on the ground clutching her ankle. Gus made it to the woman's side before anyone else, promptly covering her cheek in a wet, slobbery kiss. Devin cringed in anticipation of a rebuff, but the older woman laughed, or at least she tried to, before wincing. "Grace, you're hurt," Syndey said, her voice full of concern. Instinctively, he and Syndey crouched at the woman's side as she rolled down her sock. The skin around her ankle was already starting to pillow and discolor into blotchy pinks and blues. "How did this happen?" Syndey asked. Grace reached out and rubbed the fur behind Gus's ears, which earned her another wet kiss. "I must have jumped a little too high when I saw this guy coming. My balance isn't what it used to be." Gus dropped his chin and tucked his tail between his legs, as though he somehow understood. Devin felt as guilty as Gus looked. It wasn't Gus's fault that his stupid human wasn't paying attention, and now this sweet old lady had to suffer. Devin's heart constricted as his eyes focused back on the older woman. "My God, I am so incredibly sorry." "Nonsense. We all fall sometimes. Today was my turn." Grace winced as she patted his hand. Grace's tone was forgiving, but Syndey's icy glare let him know he was a long way from being off the hook. She took control of the situation immediately. "Let's get you to the road. There's bound to be a wagon coming along to give us a ride to town." She looked up at the rest of the birders, who were all standing around with concerned expressions. "Folks, Henry will take you on up to the north end of the bog and finish the tour while we head back to the road. Since I won't be finishing the tour with you, I'm offering refunds. You're welcome to call me for your money back or to reschedule another tour before you finish your vacations." Henry's brows arched before he nodded quickly. Devin guessed the kid was doing some mental math about those refunds and wasn't too happy with the end calculation. The kid looked worried. Were times that tough on the island? He cut a shy glance at Devin, then dropped his gaze to the ground. Devin had no idea how much a birding tour cost, but once they had a minute alone, he'd let Syndey know she didn't have to worry. He'd take care of it. The rest of the group muttered their assent as Henry led them on, and Syndey returned her attention to Grace. "I'm so sorry," Grace said. "Nonsense. You have nothing to be sorry about." Syndey winked. "Think you can walk if we each lend you a shoulder?" Syndey smiled tenderly at the woman. Her expression was so angelic, Devin's heart suddenly soared like one of the precious birds the group was looking for. "I'd like to believe that I can do anything I put my mind to," Grace said with feisty determination as she allowed the two to help her to her feet. Luckily, the road was only about a quarter-mile away. After limping through the woods, the trio stepped onto an idyllic stretch just as an empty, horse-drawn transport wagon came trundling along. Devin exhaled, relieved and impressed by Syndey's prescience. He'd been more than a little convinced that he was going to have to put the older woman on his back to carry her in. The idea of forcing her to suffer such an indignity added to an already growing amount of guilt. He helped Grace onto the seat beside the driver. Syndey hopped into the back, and Gus followed without even looking at Devin for instruction. His dog seemed quite taken. Climbing in beside them, flashes of Devin's childhood came back to him. He remembered that on an island that didn't allow motorized vehicles, Saturday mornings the main road was full of two things: bicycles and horses. As kids, he and Syndey reveled in that traffic. Riding bikes his grandfather had rescued from one of many large piles the tourists left in front of their houses, when the summer season ended, he and Syndey explored every cow path and Indian trail on the island, including those that were too grown over for any but the hardiest adventurers. They liked them the best because you could go for hours without seeing another person. The driver flicked the leather reins, rearing the horses to go, and Devin turned to look at Syndey. Her cheeks and the tip of her nose were a rich adobe red from the sun, and when she caught him gawking, the left side of her mouth curved up, sending a dimple to her cheek. She was beautiful. "You did a great job directing everyone, young lady. I gather you've got some experience herding cats," Grace said to Syndey. He agreed. Syndey smiled. "Teaching high school has given me lots of practice." "Where do you teach?" Grace asked. "Here, on the island. I'm one of about 500 people who stick around all year. We just can't seem to get enough of this place." "It's breathtaking. I can certainly see why." They all looked out at the turquoise water that ran alongside the island's main road. This stretch was one of several that offered unobstructed views of Lake Huron. To call it a lake seemed like a misnomer. Devin had once heard the Baltic Sea was smaller, and standing on any shore, there was no way to see the other side. "Though I can't imagine living full-time without a car," Grace continued. Devin could have sworn a shadow crossed Syndey's eyes. "We manage. It's definitely not for everyone, though." How did Syndey manage? The girl he knew had been so hungry for adventure, always dreaming of traveling the world. As they climbed the island's tallest trees and explored its darkest caves, Syndey had a constant refrain. One day they would travel the world doing just this, and if he wouldn't join her, she would go by herself. For years, She wanted to grow up to be a map maker, charting new terrain. It was natural for people to change as they grew older. This seemed a rather drastic change, though. "Have you always lived on this island?" Grace asked. "Nope. I grew up across the channel. I used to come here in the summer with my grandmother. She cleaned rooms at the Grand Hotel. That's how I met this one here." She nodded at him. He was pretty sure her eyes glinted as she did, or at least he hoped they had. His grandfather was our nature camp instructor. She pursed her lips tenderly at the mention of old Nate. 5 years ago, I crossed the channel and moved here for good. Grace clasped her hands. "Ah, so you two were childhood friends." "Best friends," he said, fixing his gaze on Syndey, pleased when she didn't contradict him. It was the first contribution he'd been able to make to an incredibly informative conversation. He was able to get a sense of Syndey's life without having to pry awkwardly. Throughout the ride, he'd caught Syndey glancing at Grace's ankle enough times to know that she was still quite irritated with him and Gus. If he'd asked her the questions, she might not have been as open with her answers, and he couldn't blame her. After the way he'd left things all those years ago, he was surprised she was talking to him at all, or he would have been if she were any other person. But the Syndey he knew had a heart of gold. Clearly, that hadn't changed. The wagon slowed and then stopped in front of a small, white, clapboard building on the edge of town. Gus was the first out of the wagon, and Devin handed the dog's leash to Syndey, while he lifted Grace out of the front of the wagon and escorted her into the office. This morning had taken an entirely different turn than he'd planned, and though he felt terrible about Grace, being around Syndey reminded him of some of the best aspects of his childhood, and that felt better than good. So good that as he glanced back at her, something inside of him stirred, and he couldn't help but wonder where this path would lead. Chapter 3. Syndey. Other than her annual checkups, Syndey rarely visited Dr. Albert's office. She felt terrible to be here now, escorting one of her tour guests, though Grace was being an incredibly good sport about things. Devin Fox. What a way to make a comeback. She sighed and shook her head. The doctor's office was small and tidy, with a professional yet beachy feel. Wood-paneled walls had been painted white to look like driftwood, and photographs of the Round Island lighthouse, Arch Rock, and sailboats hung on them. He changed the pictures depending on the season. During the winter, the doctor preferred frozen shots of local landscapes. Now, the odd lilac photo dotted the walls in honor of the big festival. Like his wife, Linda, who was his receptionist, Dr. Albert was born on the island, and some of their photos dated back decades. Surprisingly, the office was empty when Devin helped Syndey bring Grace inside. He left Gus outside in the shade, tied to a post, saying he'd step in just long enough to make sure she and Grace were situated. Syndey snuck a peek at him as he eased Grace into a wooden chair, his muscular forearms flexing handsomely with the gentle movement. She hadn't seen him since the summer of their first kiss. He was supposed to return the next year, but he hadn't. He'd disappeared, taking a huge chunk of her heart with him. Though she'd tried not to, Syndey had thought of him several times over the years. She knew that old Nate thought of him often, too. In her mind, she always imagined the same quiet, skinny boy who'd drawn her pictures and built forts as a kid. His body had started to change in their last summer together, but never in a million years would she have imagined the gorgeous man standing next to her. "Doc, we got someone with a hurt ankle. Might be a sprain or break. Better come out front." Linda, who'd been writing at the receptionist desk, called back to her husband in his office. Grace smiled up at Syndey. "She's good." Syndey smiled back. "Very." Linda Albert could usually name an injury on sight. She didn't even have to palpate, which was fortunate for the doctor because medical assistants keen to spend an Arctic winter on the island were few and far between. According to the doctor, his wife had something like X-ray vision, and that went beyond people's bones. She just never missed anything. The cheerful woman recognized Devin at once. "Devin Fox, is that you?" He nodded, and Syndey's heart tugged for him as she smiled slightly. Being recognized by people who knew you as a child was a special feeling. Linda darted around the receptionist's desk and wrapped Devin in a hug. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry about your grandpa. You must know how much we all loved him here. His death leaves a hole in the heart of the island." She stepped back from Devin and patted his chest once, lightly. "Sorry, sweetie. I probably should have asked before I mauled you, but, I've just been wanting to do that ever since I saw you at the funeral in St. Ignace. There were just so many people around you that I couldn't beat past them." "No worries, it's fine." "Really?" Devin said. Syndey was pretty sure he meant it. In addition to her darn near supernatural powers of observation, Linda Albert was known for two other things: her Christmas trees and her big mama bear hugs. Syndey swore some of the kids on the island scraped their knees just so they could get one of those hugs when they came into the office. They were their own kind of medicine. "It's nice to hear about the lives he touched," Devin said before pointing to the door. "My dog's waiting out on the porch. I should probably go check on him before he does something that makes you wish you hadn't laid eyes on us." He cut a glance at Syndey and she couldn't help but smile. He'd been apologizing in several different ways since he took Gus from her back at the bog. She was halfway to letting it go. Hadn't her own dog gone on a tear just this morning? Linda glanced out the front window, smiling when she saw Gus outside wagging his tail at a horse-drawn carriage shuffling past. "That would never happen, Devin Fox." She touched her hand to her chest. "It just warms my heart to see you two kids, and together at that. I always had a feeling about the two of you." She wagged her finger playfully. Her and Devin? The city boy who'd forgotten his roots? Not to mention ghosted her and broke her heart. Syndey started to say they weren't actually together, but really, what was the point? Let the woman enjoy her moment. The front door to the office closed as Doc Albert appeared from the back in his white jacket. "Sorry about the wait, was just finishing up a patient call." Syndey smiled. Only on her island would a doctor apologize to a patient for a 5-minute wait. Grace looked at her, eyes slightly rounded, clearly thinking the same thing. "I'm definitely starting to understand the appeal of this island." She chuckled, then winced. Doc's face turned serious when he caught Grace's expression. "Let's get you looked at. Why don't we?" Grace nodded and the doctor helped her into a wheelchair, then pushed her toward the exam room. "He's going to be a good 30 minutes, Sid. Why don't you wait outside with Devin? I'll call you when it's time to come back in." Sydney's palms started to sweat, even though a cool lake breeze fluttered through the open window. Why was she instantly nervous about the idea of spending 30 minutes alone with her old friend? He was just a friend. A handsome childhood friend, sure, but nothing more. He'd made that clear years ago when he'd left her standing on the dock. And she'd accepted it, hadn't she? Yes, she had. Because in life you only had 2 hands to carry, and resentment was a heavy load. Yet, as she walked outside, Sydney's thoughts drifted. Would Devin remember their shared past as vividly as she did? Hoping to somehow get an answer, she sat on the Victorian-style bench in front of the doctor's office, leaving about a foot between her and Devin. Even if she'd wanted to, which she told herself she didn't, she couldn't really have sat closer to him. Gus was sitting on the ground in that space, transfixed by a pair of seagulls flying nearby. She ran her hand along the back of Gus's neck. It was still damp from the bog, and flecks of algae came off as she rubbed. He wagged his tail and looked up at her with smiling eyes, his tongue lolling. He had a cute face and a colossal head. He looked like a cross between a Saint Bernard and a husky. "You think he's hot?" she asked. It wasn't exactly the question that had been on the tip of her tongue, but it was important. Without waiting for an answer, she swung her backpack around, pulling out a bottle of water and a collapsible dog water bowl. The corners of Devin's eyes crinkled. He hadn't put his aviators back on since her earlier comment, and she was glad. His dark eyes were beautiful. Plus, so much of a conversation seemed to be lost when people talked from behind the barrier of sunglasses. "You just happen to have dog watering devices in your backpack?" he asked. "What else you got in there, flower child?" The key to world peace? She laughingly rolled her eyes. He definitely remembered a piece of their past, the nickname he'd given her, and hearing him say it felt surprisingly good. That's a bit of a stretch, Devin Fox. He'd always bristled when she used his full name, and doing so now made her inwardly smile. No need to go all formal on me. I'm just saying I am very impressed. That's incredibly random and perfectly appropriate, even though I don't think he's hot. He ran his thumb against his brow, a mild look of confusion creasing it. Or at least not too hot. I guess I should have brought something like that just in case. It seems I'm shaping up to be something of a bad pet dad. Poor guy. He patted Gus's head, then stroked his ears. She tried not to notice the size and strength of his hands as she filled the water bowl and set it before Gus. The pooch lapped up the water quickly, then looked at her for a refill. "Yep, that was a miss," he said, his voice tinged with self-deprecation. "He's parched." "I wasn't trying to make you feel bad, Devin. It's just that when I go into the woods, I like to be prepared for any animals I might find." Sounds like something old Nate would have said. Syndey's spine stiffened, and she felt torn. On the one hand, the sadness in his voice at the mention of his grandfather made her want to reach out and comfort him with touch. On the other, she'd never liked the fact that Devin called his grandfather Old Nate. He'd started doing it the last summer she saw him. That was the summer something changed in him, and she never knew why. Not liking that thought, Syndey tried to send her mind and the conversation in a lighter direction. They talked about his job, her job, and the Great Lakes from the shores of Chicago, but nothing that gave her a sense of what he remembered about their childhood. Finally, the conversation came back to Gus. "How long have you had this adorable troublemaker?" "Little over 3 months. As you can see, we're still working on the training bit. He was hanging out around my apartment building one night when I went to the corner store to grab a bag of coffee. He followed me up the block. Waited outside. When I came out, it had started to snow. One of those freak, late April snows that sometimes happens in Chicago. Super heavy. He wouldn't leave my side when we walked back. I just couldn't leave him out there." Devin shrugged his broad shoulders. "I put up flyers and even posted an ad on Craigslist to see if anyone wanted him, but no takers. I guess he's a bit big for most people's apartments." He certainly was. A dog that size would enjoy running with her horses in the pasture. He needed space. That might have been part of the reason he'd taken off earlier. The forest freedom was exhilarating. Well, he loves you, and I'm sure he's just happy to be wherever you are. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the town, the lake, the whole world fell away, everything except for the two of them. The bench beneath them felt like a bridge connecting them to the past where he'd made that fateful promise. A light tap on her shoulder broke the spell and turned around with a start to find Linda standing there, eyes gleaming. "Have I already told you how nice it is to see you home?" She chuckled. "Doc's ready to see you." Had it been 30 minutes already? They always say time moves quickly when you're in good company. And a twinge of guilt pierced her heart as she realized that she hadn't thought once about poor Grace. "Is Grace okay?" Syndey asked. Linda bent down and patted Gus on the head, then reached into the pocket of her white coat, pulling out a bone-shaped biscuit. "Sorry, Pooch, you'll have to wait outside. We don't let dogs in anymore because some patients have allergies, but hopefully this makes up for our rules." Then Linda fixed her warm gaze on Syndey. Best to let the doc explain. Chapter 4. Syndey. Grace was sitting on a chair in the waiting room, holding a pair of crutches across her lap. Her shoulders sagged and she wore a sheepish expression. A short boot brace hugged her ankle and 5 bare toes with bright red polish stuck out from the tip. Dr. Albert gestured toward her. "Well, the good news is that nothing is broken. The bad news is that she has a level 2 sprain. That's actually rather serious for an older person, primarily because if she falls again, it could result in an even greater injury." Devin let out a long sigh that Syndey felt in her bones. She didn't even have to look at him to know what he was feeling. Terrible guilt. She lifted her eyes to his anyway, and what she saw was worse than she'd anticipated. Agony threaded his beautiful eyes. She suspected he had more than this morning's accident on his mind. His grandfather's loss had probably hit him hard, and this was likely making some of that bubble up to the surface. "Well, I'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen now, won't I?" Devin said, masking his pain with a smile so quickly, Syndey was pretty sure she was the only one who noticed. Grace cocked her head to the side. Devin met her gaze. "If you don't mind the company of one thoughtless pet parent, I'd love to be your personal nurse until you're feeling better. It's the least I can do." Grace shook her head and waved her hand emphatically. "Absolutely not. Completely unnecessary. I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself, young man. Though I do appreciate the offer. It's very kind." Dr. Albert clapped his hands once. "That's a wonderful idea. Give Grace a chance to get a taste of some real local hospitality. It's settled." Grace's eyes rounded, but she seemed too stunned to speak. "Syndey, Devin, can I see you over here for a moment?" The doctor moved to the receptionist's desk, where he scratched out a prescription on his pad. As he handed it to Syndey, he said, "We've been over this already. Grace doesn't have anyone on the island at the moment, and it just wouldn't do to have her recuperating untended." "She won't be alone, Doc. We will take care of her," Syndey assured. Though by we, she meant herself. Devin's offer was sweet, but she would be the one to take care of Grace. The woman was her tour guest after all. Besides, with old Nate gone, she'd been quite lonely. It would be nice to have some company. 30 minutes later, Grace was finally resting comfortably in bed at the cottage she'd rented for the summer. Devin had whipped her up some eggs, and Grace had excused herself for a nap once the dishes were cleared. After much bickering, she'd ultimately agreed to let Syndey and Devin check in on her for a few hours a day. "She's a tough cookie, isn't she? For a second there, I didn't think she was going to let us help out." Devin's eyes twinkled as he eased in beside Syndey on the porch swing in front of the cottage. "Devin, I really don't expect you to take this on. I can handle looking after Grace by myself." "Are you kidding me? And let you have all the fun? No way. She's funny. I'd like to help out. Plus, this view is incredible. This has got to be one of the best sitting spots on island." Syndey followed his gaze. The view of the lake at the bottom of the hill was incredible. But she opened her mouth to protest, then abruptly snapped it shut. If he wanted to help, who was she to say no? Grace seemed to like him too. And who knew, maybe the older woman gave him the same sense of comfort Syndey was experiencing. "Why don't you let me take you to dinner tonight so we can work out a schedule?" Devin leaned closer to her, and the heat of his legs steamed through her stained cargo pants. A sudden wave of self-consciousness set her nerves on edge. Syndey ran her hands over her cheeks. Until now, she'd been so focused on Grace that she hadn't even thought about what jumping into a swamp must have done to her hair and face, not to mention clothes. But if she did look a frizzy, hot mess, she couldn't tell from the expression in Devin's warm eyes. "Maybe we could go to the Grand. Remember how we always used to want to eat there as kids?" Devin asked, excitement tinging his husky voice. She hesitated. They'd spent a lot of time there as kids, going to pick up Big Mama after her shift's cleaning rooms. Syndey remembered that the one time she'd seen her grandmother lose her temper, it happened there. It had been a warm summer evening, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Devin and Syndey had come to meet her so they could all walk to the ferry. They were supposed to find her at the service entrance. But Syndey had gotten distracted by a horse-drawn carriage, bedecked in white lace and flowers. Lost in the magic of the moment, instead of going left, they went right, to the great lawn where rows and rows of chairs faced a floral arch. The wedding guests were all wearing their summer best, ladies in beautiful gowns, men in suits and ties. Devin and Syndey were in cutoffs and mud. A senior manager caught them crouching by the boxwood, grabbed them by the scruffs of their necks, and marched them back to the service entrance. "Gloria, look what I found near the front entrance. You know the policy." The man sneered. "Apparently you don't know the policy on manhandling a woman's chits," her grandmother hissed, and the man snatched his hand back from Devin and Syndey like they were hot coals. "Come on, children, let's go." Big Mama didn't speak for the whole walk to the ferry. Her jaw was so tight her muscles twitched. Trotting behind her, Syndey had felt a mixture of embarrassment and sadness. But Devin, ever the hero, had grabbed her hand and held it all the way to the dock. When they got there, he whispered words that lit up her world. "One day I'll have enough money to buy that place. When I do, we'll get married there." "Promise?" she'd asked. "Promise." In all the years since, Syndey had never been inside the Grand Hotel. Though his words had been so sweet, that day long ago had left her with a feeling of shame, a sense that she wasn't good enough to go in through the front door. Her cheeks heated as she thought about all the reasons she should say no to Devin's invitation. Seeming to sense her hesitation, Devin nudged. "After the mess I made of your morning, I'd appreciate an opportunity to make it up to you, or at least try." "That's nice of you." "Is that a yes?" He smiled. "We don't have to go to the Grand. We can go anywhere your heart desires." She sucked in a sharp breath. Hearing him talk about her heart made it jump in her chest. Spending time with Devin out in the woods or looking after Grace was one thing, but going to a restaurant, especially a fancy one, felt like a date. Syndey hadn't been on a date in years, and she didn't know if she was ready to wade back into the pool. The early adventures hadn't worked out very well. Not that there'd been that many. Other than the foolish summer when she'd thought there might have been something between her and Devin, she'd had one real boyfriend. He packed up his pickup truck after college in search of the bright lights of the big city. If Grand Rapids, Michigan, even counted as that. Since him, she'd just told herself she was too busy for a man. But the truth was, she knew that most men wouldn't be willing to live on a small island with her when leaving wasn't an option. Devin waved his hand in front of her face. "Earth to flower, child. It's me, Devin." She looked into his eyes. Devin wasn't Sean. Devin had returned home to the island. Devin was safe, and this wasn't a date. It was just two old friends catching up. "Okay, Devin, we'll meet back here this afternoon and then go for dinner afterward." That wasn't so hard, was it? Chapter 5. Devin. This was strange. Outside of fast cars and killer trades, not much usually excited Devin. But as he pedaled down the winding path, the heat flushing his skin wasn't just because he'd done more bike riding in the last 30 minutes than he'd done in the last 3 years. It was her, Syndey, riding ahead, on her lime green rider, her laughter floating back to him like a melody that tugged at his heart in ways he couldn't quite explain or comprehend. Another thing he didn't typically understand was women. Not that he usually delved very deep into their mysteries, but if there was any lingering upset over this morning's mishap, he couldn't tell. Syndey seemed to be in high spirits, and he liked to think it had something to do with their reunion. That was definitely true for him. The bike ride from Grace's had felt like old times, filled with banter, laughs, and a levity he hadn't experienced in years. Probably since the last summer they were together. Catching a glimpse of wildflowers swaying gently by the trail, Devin slowed, a spontaneous idea taking root. He dismounted, plucking a delicate daisy, its petals a vibrant contrast to the yellow center and green leaves. Almost catching up to her, he called out with a hint of mock exasperation. "Hey, you sure that bike doesn't have some kind of secret motor or something?" "Sorry, you having a hard time keeping up back there, city boy?" She glanced over her shoulder and her gaze landed on the flower. Her expression softened from playful to tender. "For you," he said, pedaling alongside her. "You remembered," she said, her voice rich with gratitude, and he could have sworn her eyes misted as she tucked the daisy behind her ear. How could he forget? A vivid memory of attending her parents' funeral with his grandfather played out before his mind's eye. White and yellow had blanketed everything, a sea of serenity at a time of sorrow. As children, Syndey had often said that holding daisies made her feel like her mother was right there, comforting her. "Of course," he affirmed softly. She chuckled, the sound tinged with nostalgia. "I dated a guy for 2 years, and he always got me red roses." "Yeah, it can be hard to bring the newbies up to speed. Sounds like it's a good thing he's in the past." His words carried a light humor, but inside, curiosity stirred. Was she single now? The thought of her being with someone else suddenly seemed inconceivable. A quaint, worn sign that read "Crab House" popped into view, and she slowed. "This is it," she said. Devin squeezed the handbrake on the bike he'd found at his grandfather's cabin, easing it to a stop. The restaurant, nestled on the quiet edge of downtown, exuded a casual charm. They parked their bikes beneath the sprawling shade of a sycamore tree. "You have a seating preference?" she asked as they walked across the grass toward the restaurant. "Nah, anywhere's good," he replied, following her lead to a cozy table on the edge of the patio. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten in a restaurant where the hostess didn't direct you to a seat. Settled across from Syndey, he smoothed his hands over his thighs and took in the laid-back atmosphere with a contented sigh. With no water view, fewer ventured here to eat. He didn't mind being away from the crowds. It gave him an opportunity to have her all to himself. "Cool spot," he said, his gaze settling on her radiant smile. She looked effortlessly chic in her cutoffs and simple white top. Her floppy hat hung from a scarf around her neck, and dangling wooden earrings, shaped like trees, hung from her ears. After the look she'd given him, when he'd suggested the Grand earlier, he'd had a feeling she was going to pick something low-key. He was glad he opted for jeans instead of slacks. Super chill vibe. Syndey's smile deepened, and her eyes lit up. "I'm glad you approve. I thought it would be a good way to ease us into grown-up hangs." "I'm with you there. No need to rush." Except part of him did want to rush, straight through dinner and right into a sweeter, more intimate phase. The last summer they'd seen each other, he'd often imagined a moment where he could express his feelings for her without holding back, but then he'd been too shy for his own good, at least when it came to the opposite sex. Fear of rejection was part of the reason he stopped coming to the island when he knew she'd be there. But times changed, and so had he. The years had given him a new kind of confidence, a smooth assurance that came with experience. Now he could pick up those subtle signals, letting him know that a woman was into him. This attraction definitely wasn't one way, even if she seemed to be slow to admit it. Sneaking a peek at her over the plastic menu, their eyes met, and when he glimpsed her shy half-smile, a fresh wave of desire shot through him. He couldn't believe how beautiful she was. She ditched the braid she was wearing this morning, allowing corkscrew curls to fall wildly down her back. "So, do you have a recommendation?" he asked, trying to focus on the black and white letters before him. Crab House's menu was pretty simple. Sandwiches, salads, and fried local fish. Nothing that screamed, "I'm sorry you had to mess up your morning to dive into a smelly bog to rescue my dog. Oh, and double sorry about almost killing one of your customers." Syndey smiled at him. "Nope. I don't eat out much. I've never been here before." Though he admired her simplicity and the humility it reflected, he couldn't help saying, "When I mentioned an apology dinner, I was picturing something with a little more pizzazz. You know, a string quartet, a sunset cruise." She raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Oh, really? And here I thought a walleye sandwich was the height of gourmet eating." Huh. He'd just have to surprise her on their next date, and if he had anything to say about it, there was definitely going to be a next date. A tall, sandy-haired waiter quickly came to fill 2 recycled jelly glasses with water before taking their order. "Do you have champagne?" Devin asked, seizing the opportunity to keep up the playful banter. Syndey made a face, her expression comically exaggerated. "What, you don't like champagne, Syd?" She shrugged. "You know what, I don't really like it either, but isn't that what the fancy folk do when they celebrate? And if ever there was an occasion to celebrate—" He jokingly speared the air with his pinky. Syndey laughed. "It's our party. I say we do fancy our way with some island champagne." He nodded. "All right, rum runners it is." A wave of relief washed over him. How many events had he attended where he felt compelled to play a certain role, champagne flute in hand, smile perfectly practiced? Here, with Syndey, there was a refreshing authenticity that allowed him to drop the pretenses. The simplicity of island life, the ease of being with someone who knew him truly, was like a breath of fresh air. They placed their orders, both opting for fish sandwiches with extra tartar sauce, Cajun fries, and Southern-style coleslaws. As the waiter left, Syndey quipped, "Great minds think alike, or is it great stomachs?" "Yeah, we always did have a lot in common, didn't we?" Syndey nodded, and her eyes lit with nostalgia. "You remember the forts we used to build in the woods? How we'd get lost out there for hours?" "I do." He remembered other things, too, like how he never really came to life until the first day of summer when they met on the dock. He remembered how they'd spent 2 summers building an entire sailboat by hand, how they'd talked about sailing around the world in it one day, and how all that changed when they separated on the last day of the season. "It's great to have you back, Devin. I've been missing Nate so much, and, well, it's nice to have you here." "It's good to be back," he said, surprised at how much he meant it. He hadn't realized how much he missed her. "I love seeing you. You've grown into a beautiful woman." Syndey flushed, the glow spreading from the ends of her collarbones to the tips of her cheeks. "Thanks, Dev. You're not so bad yourself." Now it was his turn to feel the heat. He shifted in his chair. "So, what's up with you and the hat?" "Is that a staple?" Syndey fingered the scarf fondly. "It's a lucky hat. Big Mama used to wear it in the garden. Don't you remember?" "Now I do." Devin smiled. "Big Mama. Man, how are your sisters and grandparents?" he asked, genuinely excited. Big Mama had been like a second grandmother to him growing up. "The twins are good. Zoe is finishing up medical school downstate, and Mila is practicing law in the U.S. Virgin Islands. But Big Mama and Pops passed away about 5 years ago." His heart dropped. Big Mama was dead? That was not the answer he'd expected to hear. He'd always regarded the proud, loving woman as invincible, a fixture of childhood summers that seemed as permanent as the island itself. "Syd, I'm so sorry." "Yeah, it was a heavy blow." "I bet." He tapped the table and held her gaze for a moment. "What happened?" A flash of sadness crossed her face, but she pushed it back quickly, and he felt bad about making her relive an obvious pain. "Car accident. They did everything together up until the very end. I won't lie, it hurt." His heart ached at her words, a mixture of empathy and deep-seated regret. Regret for not being there, for being so wrapped up in his own life that he'd missed the chance to offer her comfort when she needed it most. He wanted to take her in his arms, but the weight of his guilt kept him in his seat, and he settled for taking her hand instead. "Syd, that's the same way your parents went." She'd grown up under the cloud of that loss. He could only imagine how having her grandparents die the same way would have affected her. "It is, but we're not here to talk about my woes." She smiled sadly and waved him on. He missed her hand as soon as it was no longer in his. "How's life in Chicago been?" Torn between probing further and answering, Devin decided not to pry. He recognized a boundary when he saw one. "Chicago's been good to me. We've had our ups and downs, but I'm working for a brokerage firm in the city, and I'm on track for a big promotion. The goal is to go solo soon. You know me. I work better on my own." Syndey smiled. "Remember when we were kids, and I said one day I'd buy the Grand, 2 or 3 more years, and I'll be able to." He leaned back in this chair. What he didn't tell her was that he would have been able to buy it 5 years back if he hadn't gotten derailed by his own loss 5 years ago. His father had died. The emotional impact had him forcing trades, and before he knew it, he'd lost $25 million and a trading position at a coveted firm. "That's amazing. Congratulations, Dev. I always knew you could do anything." The pride shining in her eyes made his heart swell. A surge of warmth flooded through him. It was as if the arduous climb of his career, the sacrifices and relentless pursuit had all been validated by that single look. She took a sip of her water. And I love how the big deal jobs are letting people work remotely nowadays. You know, I've been thinking, Nate and I always sailed together in the 4th of July parade. Now that you're back, maybe you and I could partner. It'd be a nice way for us to honor him. He looked at her intently, trying to make sense of her last comments. The 4th was a month away. She didn't think he was going to be here permanently, did she? As charming as all of this was, he had a life in Chicago. A well-paying job, a condo in the Gold Coast, and a Saturday afternoon tradition that included him speeding up Lakeshore Drive blasting old Al Green songs. None of which was possible here on this fairy tale island that didn't even allow scooters. Thanks, Sid, but I can't work remotely forever. I called my boss and let him know I'll be back in 2 weeks. The words, once spoken, cast a shadow over them. 2 weeks, she repeated. He watched as the light in her eyes dimmed, her hopeful expression dissolving into one of realization and disappointment. And then Devin did what he always did in situations like that. He looked away. Chapter 6, Devin. But what about Nate's school? Syndey asked, a barely audible crack in her voice. Devin winced. This conversation was suddenly moving far and fast from second date territory into an area he wasn't ready to face. I have a friend from Chicago, Samantha. She sells commercial real estate. She thinks she'll be able to get me a buyer pretty quickly. Mackinac Island is a solid market. Tourists eat this old-fashioned living up like it's candy, Murdoch's fudge to be exact. He attempted a joke, but when Syndey didn't respond, he swallowed. The waiter came and dropped off their drinks and sandwiches. Grateful for the interruption, Devin smoothed the napkin over his lap and tried to shake off his tension with a long dip from his rum runner. The familiar taste of rum and fruit helped him steady his nerves. Trading had taught him on more than one occasion that losing focus could cost you everything in life. No matter how adorable Syndey was, Mackinac Island was a chapter in his life that needed closing, not reopening. Bon appétit, he said, hoping the meal would lighten the mood. He waited for Syndey to take her first bite before he dug in. He hadn't eaten all day and was famished. The fish was good. It tasted fresh, and the crispy breading was seasoned well. There was a bunch of smoked trout at Old Nate's, but he couldn't bring himself to eat it. Reminded him too much of his grandfather and the fishing they did when he was young. Initially, he'd only planned to stay a few days and to eat out mostly. But now that he'd extended his trip to help care for Grace, he would have to pick up a few things to munch on. Last night, the island's grocer had closed by the time he arrived. Tonight would be another miss, but shopping was going to have to be one of the first stops he made after the lawyer's office tomorrow. Maybe he'd swing by the fish market. He picked up the second half of his sandwich, only then realizing Syndey had finished her drink but hadn't eaten more than the one bite of her food. "What's wrong? Not what you expected? I'll have them bring you something else, Syd." He started to signal for the waiter, but she stopped him. "The food is fine, Devin. Tell me, what will happen if you sell the school?" Syndey sounded tense. He put down his sandwich, his appetite fading. "I was kind of hoping we could avoid that topic." "I gathered that," she said. "Can we talk about it anyway?" He sighed. So much for light and uncomplicated. He'd looked over the numbers. The school had been operating in the red for the last year. Devin didn't have the time or the energy to invest in trying to turn it around, if in fact that could even be done. He knew nothing about running a school. "Honestly, Syd, I have no idea." He glanced at the bar of the restaurant. "Maybe they'll turn it into a brewery. I don't think there are any breweries on island. It could be open all year, provide a little extra entertainment for the poor lot who are stuck here year-round." "It's a choice, Devin. Living here on this island is a choice that we make, and it would be nice if you wouldn't talk about that choice like it meant we've got no sense. You, of all people, should understand that there's much more to this island than Main Street, but maybe all that city living prevents you from seeing that now." His chest tightened. He didn't mean to make light of the life she'd chosen. To a certain extent, he got it. Kinda, sort of, almost. In small doses, the island was charming, like a weekend, a week maximum. As a kid, the only thing that made summers endurable was Syndey. After the thrill of fudge shops, water views, and horse-drawn carriages wore off, he just didn't understand how anyone could think of making life here permanent. There wasn't enough to do, and having to schedule his life around a ferry back and forth to the mainland gave him a serious, lost-at-sea feeling. A Bermuda Triangle-scale fog threatened to swallow his mind at the mere thought of living here permanently. He rubbed his chin. Syndey's bottom lip trembled. She was clearly upset, and that, in turn, upset him. In more than one way, he realized with some surprise. He wasn't used to caring about a woman's feelings this intensely. This was new. Sorry, Syd. I get that it's a choice, and I respect that choice. I didn't mean to be insensitive. Her eyes moistened and his heart broke in two. He'd done that. I know, Devin. I know you've got a pure heart. But what is going to happen to the kids who are enrolled there? Other than the school, there aren't any real jobs for most of them here. It took him a minute to find his words as he basked in the confidence of her declaration about the purity of his heart. I trade stocks. I don't know much about alternative uses for commercial real estate, and even less about schools. The thought gave him a headache. He took a long sip from his drink. I know about schools. Maybe I could help. He laughed. Syndey, teaching high schoolers is not the same thing as running a college for profit. He didn't mean to scoff, but he had, and he regretted it as soon as the sound came out of his mouth. Her eyes narrowed, and she looked away. He'd offended her. He felt bad, but wrapping up his grandfather's estate had been weighing on him so heavily that discussing it brought out his worst. Tomorrow, the attorney should be able to tell him about the legal ramifications of closing the school before the students, all 30 of them, had an opportunity to graduate. The tuition was so low, he was fairly certain he'd make more than enough money from the sale of the school to reimburse them, if he had to. Her eyes met his again, and she leaned across the table. So, you're just going to close the doors and throw these kids out on the street? He shrugged. I'm sure I'll be able to give them refunds. But what about their educations? Her tone was beginning to upset him. These people were not his responsibility, financial or otherwise. I don't know, Syd. I don't have it all figured out. But the fact is that sometimes when people die, their big pet projects die with them. In this case, I suppose the students will just have to transfer to another boat-building school somewhere else. Syndey's mouth dropped open, and her face turned red. For a second, he almost thought she might be choking on her food, but she hadn't really eaten anything. No, she was choking on her own anger. At him. The nearest boating school is thousands of miles away from the island. There's more to the world than this small island. It would probably do them some good to get out there and start to see it. That last remark earned him a gasp, but he was spared a cutting retort by the approach of a new waiter. Timothy Miller, is that you? Syndey said, smiling in a way that Devin could tell took effort. Oh, hey, Miss St. James. The boy's expression lifted. It's good to see you. Her red coloring muted somewhat. Whoever he was, she was clearly happy to see him, but she was still angry too. She turned to Devin. Timothy was one of my students. He's studying at Central Michigan now. Congratulations, that's awesome. You having a good time? Devin tried to take her lead and swallow the heat of their conversation to talk casually. The teen shrugged, and his serious expression surprised Devin, who remembered college as one long party. It's a lot different than home, Timothy said. Syndey gave the boy's forearm a light squeeze. Hang in there, sweetie. It's only 4 years. Then you can come home. And be a lifelong waiter at the crab house? Maybe one day, if I'm lucky, they'll promote me to head waiter. He gave a mirthless chuckle. "It was good to see you, Miss St. James. I have to get back inside and check on the other tables." Devin half wondered if the boy's entrance had been staged. He couldn't have scripted a better way to make Syndey's point about limited jobs on the island. When she declined dessert, Devin was forced to accept that dinner was over, but he wasn't ready to end the evening. Back at their bikes with their takeout bags, the wind picked up. It occurred to him that the lake would be a beautiful place to watch a sunset. He could put his arm around her shoulder as shelter from the chill. Maybe that would help to recapture some of the evening's earlier magic and salvage their outing. He and his grandfather had watched it go down several times when he came to visit during the summer, but summer twilight fell after 9 p.m. Syndey was always back in St. Ignace well before the sun set, so this would be a first for them. "Hey, why don't we take out the sailboat and watch the sunset?" Her dark eyes met his. "I don't think so." "Well, let me ride with you to your cottage," he said, his voice thickening with emotion. They'd gained ground today, and he felt it slipping away. "Actually, I think I'd like to be alone right now, but thank you for dinner. It was nice catching up with you." She swung her long, toned legs over the bicycle and pedaled off, leaving him standing under the sycamore tree, shaking his head. Watching her disappear around the bend, a hollow opened inside of him. He felt more alone than he had in a very long time. When he got back to the cabin, he threw his wallet on the table, only then realizing he'd forgotten to reimburse her for the tour he'd interrupted. Well, there was always tomorrow. If she'd talked to him. She had been so angry, but even with her eyes blazing, he'd wanted to taste her lips, which he realized on some level was totally inappropriate. After the way he'd treated her, he didn't even deserve to dream about her. He climbed into bed on top of the quilt. The sound of insects buzzing outside of his window filled the air. He tucked his hands behind his head on the pillow, staring at the ceiling fan well after. He turned out the lights, and his eyes adjusted to the island's inky darkness. Snippets from the evening came back to him, her laugh, her smile, the waiter's comment. He crossed his legs at the ankle. That comment couldn't have been timelier, as though old Nate were meddling from the other side. The whole reason he'd built the school was to help the island to gain economic independence. But at what cost? His grandfather was a sentimental old man who had been so involved in that school that he rarely left Mackinac. It was everything to him. There was no way Devin wanted to be ruled by his emotions or tied to this island year-round, not to mention the financial burden. He liked kids, but not enough to go into debt subsidizing their educations. Tons of thoughts rolled around in his mind, but the one that kept his eyes wide for most of the night was that Syndey had said he had a pure heart. That wasn't the way most traders were described, but he had to admit a small piece of him liked the version of himself reflected in her eyes. Was he doing the wrong thing in selling old Nate's school? Chapter 7. Syndey. Syndey woke up feeling like she'd been swaddled in a blanket made of King Arthur's chainmail. Her limbs were heavy and her lids swollen. Everything hurt. Most of all, her heart. It felt like there was an anvil on top of it. Last night had started full of promise and ended in disaster. She rolled over and opened the blinds. It should have been stormy and overcast outside, but as if to mock her, sunlight poured in through the window. The alarm clock on her bedside table showed 5:30 a.m., and even though she'd been in bed for 8 hours, she was exhausted, having tossed and turned all night, plagued by thoughts of Devin. Since laying eyes on him yesterday morning, she'd been riding a roller coaster of emotion. The man was beautiful, and being around him reminded her of those light and easy summer days of childhood. Feelings that were hard to reconcile with her anger over his cavalier attitude toward old Nate's legacy. How was it possible that Devin had become this money-obsessed person? Not only was he not staying on the island as she'd assumed, he planned to undo his grandfather's hard work with the stroke of a pen. Old Nate prided himself on continuing his First Nations boat-building tradition through this school, selling to some nameless, faceless stranger whose only concern for the island was how much profit they could squeeze from it was wrong. An affront to everything Old Nate stood for, pure and simple. How was it possible that he didn't see that? What had happened to the caring young boy who loved drawing pictures of animals and had tried to defend her when the rich vacation kids picked on her during summer camp? Where was the kid who promised to marry her when the snooty manager kicked them out of the Grand? Based on last night's conversation, it didn't even seem like he remembered that part of the promise. Yes, that was years ago. And no, of course, she didn't plan to hold him to it, especially after the great ghosting. Yet, despite everything, she didn't want to let go of the idea that the old Devin still existed. He was old Nate's grandson, after all. There had to be some way to make him see, or at least to put a stop to this. That school meant too much to the island to allow for any other outcome. Frustration making her blood boil, she crumpled the bedsheet in her fist. Noticing the wrinkles she was making in the fabric, Syndey let go of the sheets and a long sigh as April, her 2-year-old tabby, hopped up on the bed. The springs creaked beneath the purring cat's weight. "Whoa, good morning to you too, girl. You've put on a few pounds, my friend." The cat looked up and meowed, then nuzzled against Sydney's cheek with her soft nose. Seconds later, brown sugar came crashing through the bedroom door. April scrambled to the edge of the bed near the wall, clearly trying to hide. The two seemed to be engaged in a perpetual game of chase. When Syndey agreed to take in the cat, she'd hoped the two animals would become friends. She liked the idea of having a mate for each animal, but as usual, life had its own plans, and the pair never really bonded, unless there was some hidden delight in running from one another that Syndey couldn't see. "It's okay, April. Shug just wants to play," she said, running her hand along the back of the cat's head. These morning wake-up calls were a new thing for April. Over the last few weeks, the cat had grown increasingly affectionate. April laid down in a patch of sun on Sydney's pillow, rolling onto her belly. Had the cat's nipples always been that dark? Her stomach looked larger than usual, too. "April, are you about to make me a kitty, Grandma?" Most of the folks on island let their cats roam, so there was a high probability that April had found a mate. Syndey gave the cat some extra scratches, a smile falling over her face at the thought of kittens. Shug dropped her chin on the edge of the bed, equally demanding of attention. Syndey chuckled at the pooch's adorable face. "I suppose you guys are hungry, aren't you? Especially you." She flicked the cat's pink nose. At the mention of food, Sugar turned circles in the quiet bedroom, then trotted out to her bowl in the kitchen. Syndey threw on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt before following. Despite their incessant expressions of hunger, the cat and dog were finicky eaters. Syndey reached into the cupboard and pulled out a can of tuna. Using a can opener, she punctured the top so that she could add tuna oil to both of their bowls. The smell did the trick, seducing both of them to their breakfasts. So as not to show favoritism to the indoor animals, she grabbed a few wild apples from a paper bag in the pantry and went outside to feed the rest of the gang. The horses were first to come, followed closely by the llamas, with the goats bringing up the rear. As the gentle animals approached her and took their turns eating, her heart swelled. She loved watching them eat from her hand. When the apples were gone, she wiped her sticky, moist hands on the back of her cutoffs, quickly at first, then slowing as an idea rolled around her head. What if there was a way to sweeten the BBA pot for Devin? He was a trader after all, and weren't they motivated by numbers? There had to be a way she could come up with something that he wouldn't be able to refuse. Hopeful, she skipped back into the house, hastily putting on a pot of coffee and showering. She wasn't due at Grace's for another 2 hours, which gave her just enough time to track down several boat dealers in Michigan. If she could get them to agree to buy sailboats from the school, that would bring in some income immediately. In time, the program could expand, and that would bring in even more income. Syndey carried her laptop onto the front porch and shot off emails to the most promising mid-sized dealers located in the Midwest. While she was at it, she sent old Nate's obituary to Rhonda, a friend from college who worked for the Detroit Free Press. Maybe a little media attention would garner interest from some of the local boat dealerships. In addition to the obituary, Syndey sent Rhonda 3 little paragraphs about Nate's hopes for the school and what it had meant to the island since he'd opened the school's doors. It gave high school graduates that weren't interested in traditional college a lucrative career option. Each year, more and more natives had been able to stay on island upon graduation, keeping friends and families together and making the community that much stronger. Syndey pressed send. Knowing her friend kept busy, Syndey doubted she would hear back from her by the end of the week. Syndey took a sip of what Big Mama used to joke was her coffee-flavored cream. Closing her eyes, she tried to think of other strategies to save the school. A few minutes later, the ringing of her cell phone interrupted her thoughts. Hello? Syndey? Rhonda, are you okay? You sound like you've been crying. Yes, I'm fine. I just finished reading your email. Sydney's heart started to beat wildly in her chest. Her friend's tone wasn't giving anything away. Yeah? Yes, girl, I want to run the story today. What else can you tell me about old Nate? Her mouth dropped and she almost let the laptop slide off her knees. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. But Rhonda's enthusiasm made her feel like the sadness and determination she'd been nursing for the last few weeks could finally come together into something good. And more than anything, Rhonda's call was the little speck of hope she needed to restore her own flagging faith. Really? Rhonda was silent for a moment, as if she were trying to find the right words. Really? This story is so moving, Syndey. The person you described was a visionary, a true man of the people, an inspiration. I want folks to know his name, and I want folks to rally to save his life's work. Thank you, Syndey said softly. Then she took a deep breath and began to share more about old Nate, his struggles, and his achievements. As she spoke, she could hear Rhonda typing furiously on her computer, and her heart leapt. With this article, Campaign Save the School might actually have a real shot. Chapter 8. Devin. Devin rolled the ballpoint pen between his index finger and thumb as his grandfather's attorney, Dale Robbins, flipped through a small stack of papers, searching for a signature page. I think there are only a few more left. Then BBA and the cabin are all yours. Welcome back to the island, son. A pit opened up in Devin's stomach as he thought of Sydney's words last night. He hated to disappoint her, but he had to be practical. The probability of him turning that school around was too low for him, and the cabin was of no use to him either. Other than sleeping, he hadn't been able to spend 5 minutes inside of his grandfather's place. Old Nate's wood smoke scent lingered on the rough-hewn walls, such that each corner filled Devin with memories and regrets. This morning, he'd toyed with the idea of renting a room on island, but everything seemed to be full on account of the Lilac Festival. Staying at a hotel probably wasn't a good idea anyway. He had a lifetime's worth of things to box and sort through if he wanted to get the cabin on the market within the next month. Devin leaned over the attorney's desk and scratched his signature out on the last page. So, what's my obligation to the current students if I close the school? Robin's eyes rounded slightly, and Devin had the distinct feeling he was being judged. But as far as Devin could tell, closing the school during the summer would be the best time. Most of the students were already out. It was still early enough that they could apply to other schools and start in the fall semester. Is that what you're planning on doing? Robbins asked. If he had any doubts about Robin's position, his tone made it clear. The man practically hissed his question. Devin stood. Look, I know it's not a popular decision with the island, but the island isn't going to have to pay the bills to keep those doors open. I don't know how my grandfather managed. The land taxes alone are greater than tuition. The school has been running in the red for at least a year. Robbins pushed his chair away from his desk and looked up at Devin. You know, I suggested to your grandfather that he stipulate you not be able to sell this property, but he was convinced you would do the right thing. Devin's brows rose. This man had a lot of nerve butting into his personal business. Devin held the man's steely gaze as Robbins continued to speak. You might be surprised what this town is willing to do to keep that school open. It means a lot to these people. So did your grandfather. You saw the turnout for his funeral service. There wasn't a person on island who didn't show up for him. Devin recalled the service. Hundreds of people had patiently waited outside of the church to come in for the viewing, and the ferry made a special run just so that the islanders could make it to the service. Though now that he thought about it, there was one person whose face he didn't remember seeing. Syndey. Strange. He knew they'd run the tour company together until just before old Nate died, and from the pictures he'd come across in his cabin, they'd grown incredibly close these last few years. In fact, Syndey was probably the closest person to old Nate. Why wasn't she at the service? He sighed. Thinking about that idealistic save-the-world crusader did him no good now. I wouldn't even begin to know how to ask for help saving the school. I don't think I have it in me to do that. Well, the town shouldn't suffer on account of your pride, Devin Fox. Taken aback at the old man's terse tone, Devin clenched his fists and crossed to the door. Hand on the handle, he turned back to Robbins. How long till you have an answer to my question about closing the school? The other man folded his arms over his chest and scowled so fiercely Devin was damn tempted to take his business elsewhere. I'll have to look into it. I'll have an answer in the next couple days. Devin nodded and headed out, closing the attorney's door behind him. The fresh morning air felt good in his lungs. The last 5 minutes in Robin's office had been hell. He'd nearly suffocated on the self-righteous man's disdain. Thankfully, he'd only be on island for 2 more weeks. Showing his face with locals would be tough once word got out that he wanted to close the school. If word got out. Robbins was bound by confidentiality, and the Syndey he knew didn't trade in secrets. He felt a twinge of guilt about that, like he was benefiting from a loyalty he didn't deserve. But that was the thing about Syndey. Her giving never depended on the worth of the recipient. When they were teens, one of the older girls in summer camp went drinking in the boathouse with a summer boy. A tempestuous bully who'd often targeted Syndey, she ended up getting pregnant and moving away. Devin had overheard her confiding in Syndey before she left. The whole town speculated about her whereabouts, and Syndey never told. She was true blue, or stubborn as an ox, depending on how you looked at it. 10 minutes later, Devin walked into Dowd's Grocery, the oldest family-owned grocery in the country, according to the sign hanging over the door. He figured he'd pick up a few things for Grace and something special for Syndey while he was at the store. Maybe the right purchase would help make up for last night and get them back on the second date track. If he had to be here, he might as well enjoy himself. And Syndey was definitely enjoyable. That is, if he could keep her attention off the school. Sooner or later, she had to come to her senses. It just wasn't practical to ask someone to make such a huge sacrifice for a bunch of strangers. Sentiment was nice on a Hallmark card, but in real life? Come on. He picked up a handbasket, walking up and down the few short aisles looking for something good. Eggs were first in, for his house and Grace's, having noticed yesterday that she was running low. He also picked up orange juice for both of them and milk, too. For himself, he picked up some bananas. The meat prices made him finally decide to dip into his grandfather's stash of smoked fish. It made no sense to let that go to waste. He should probably bring some to Syndey and Grace, too. 2 runs around the store, and he still wasn't sure what to get for Syndey. Finally, he slowed in the candy aisle. He thought about picking up some Murdoch's fudge, but it felt too touristy. When Syndey was 10, Big Mama started giving her an allowance. Each week, they would come to the store and pick up a candy bar. He would choose a Baby Ruth because somehow his young mind thought he'd grow up to be a pro athlete, and she always picked whatchamacallits because the name made her laugh. That's exactly what they needed right now. Some laughter. He scooped up 4, her favorite number. Just in case that didn't work, he picked up a bottle of Riesling from a winery on the Leelanau Peninsula. He'd been there with friends a few summers ago. In some ways, the views rivaled Napa, and he wondered if she'd been. If she hadn't, maybe they could sneak away while he was here. That would be a good way to make up for the trouble he'd been causing her. If he could get around her disappointment in him. Honestly, the mere prospect seemed impossible. "I can take you over here," a nearby cashier called out. Devin came to with a start. He'd been zoning out. He moved over to her lane and put his items on the conveyor belt. Taped on the side of the cash register, a neon yellow flyer invited everyone to sign up for the upcoming boat parade. He remembered the happiness in Syndey's eyes last night when she suggested they partner. That race had always meant a lot to her. They'd spent a summer preparing for it a lifetime ago. A pang of sadness made him drop his eyes. The bottle of wine was the last item on the belt, and when the cashier picked it up, Devin hesitated. Should he even bother with an apology? There was so much distance between them, from the past, from the present, and in 2 weeks he was going to close the school, leave the island, and likely never return. Was it even fair for him to try to smooth things over, knowing he wasn't going to give Syndey what she wanted to make things right? Chapter 9, Syndey. Syndey and Grace were enjoying mid-morning coffee and a light lake breeze on the front porch when a familiar figure crested the top of the hill. Syndey tipped the brim of her hat back and squinted. Devin lumbered toward them, arms full of groceries, her gaze locked with his and her breath caught. She'd just taken her third sip from the lukewarm cup, and it suddenly felt too hot. So did the skin on her neck and cheeks. In spite of their argument last night, her heart quickened at the sight of him. He'd finally ditched his designer hat and put on a more sensible pair of outdoor shoes. The "I haven't ridden a bike in years" cowboy gait was narrowing too. Did that mean he was finally adapting to the island? Best to not get her hopes up. Once he and Gus got to the edge of the cottage's small yard, Gus started wagging his tail and pulling against the end of his leash. The excited dog had to weigh well over 100 pounds, and the bags looked heavy too. She admired Devin for having the strength required to navigate such a load without breaking a sweat, but remembering yesterday's events, she stepped off the porch to grab Gus's leash. Just in case. Grace was resting her ankle on a wicker footstool, and she wasn't sure how delicate the dog would be with the older woman. Part of her questioned Devin's prudence in bringing him here. The other part understood why he wouldn't want to leave his dog alone in a strange place. "Hey boy," she said to Gus. The dog responded by wagging his tail even more vigorously, but he didn't jump, which was nice. "It's good to see you." Devin chuckled. "But not me." Syndey put her free hand on her hip. She wasn't going to go there with him, not in front of Grace. "You're early, 4 hours early." She hadn't planned on seeing him just yet. They'd agreed on alternating shifts. "You used to love surprises," he shrugged. "Don't worry, I'll be back this afternoon, too. I stopped by the store this morning and picked up a few things. I noticed Grace was running low on eggs and milk." He headed up the porch stairs toward Grace. "Nice to see you, young man." "You too, Grace. You're looking beautiful as ever. How's the ankle doing?" he asked, leaning in to give her a quick peck on the cheek. "Much better today than yesterday. I've been doing my mental healing exercises." Grace tapped her temple. "Mind over matter," Devin said. "Exactly." She patted her boot. "Syndey just put on a new pot of coffee. I hope you'll stay for a cup." "Don't mind if I do," he said, smiling. "Brought you a few things from the store." "Oh, that's so kind of you, dear. You two really are something else." Grace started to get up, and Syndey gave her a pointed look. "I'll take care of it, Grace." Grace smiled and settled back into the chair. In the kitchen, Syndey set down her coffee and emptied the contents of one bag, then put them into the fridge. Devin hadn't taken his eyes off of her since he'd followed her in. The heat on her neck and cheeks started to spread. Huffing in frustration, she tried to distract herself by focusing on unloading the grocery bags. When she got to the second bag, she pulled out 4 whatchamacallits and a bottle of Riesling. "Nice of you to buy Grace candy and a bottle of wine." Devin hesitated. "That's for you. I was hoping you'd share a glass with me. Later, of course." Syndey raised her eyebrow. Using childhood weaknesses to curry favor? South not fair. He laughed, then crossed the small kitchen to stand next to her at the fridge. Look, Syndey, I owe you an apology. I was insensitive last night. I realize how close you were to my grandfather, and your loyalty to his vision is understandable. I'm sorry for the comment I made about projects dying with people. I don't know what got into me. Were they making progress? That was the first time Devin had referred to old Nate as his grandfather since arriving. Syndey opened the cupboard and deliberated over her choice of mugs for a second before picking one for Devin. She poured him a cup of coffee and handed it to him. Turning it in his large hand, his dark eyes lightened. Did you really just give me a clay mug with a nose picker sculpted into the side? The right corner of her lip curled upwards. She tried not to laugh. He nudged her before taking a sip. Does that mean you forgive me? That was a good question. She cocked her head to the side and looked at the ceiling above his head. I don't know, Devin. You don't know if you forgive me or you don't know what the cup means. He held it up and studied the finger going into the nose. Does it mean I should be on the lookout for some nugget inside of my coffee? That's just gross. She screwed up her face and laughed. He fingered the mug. Perhaps it's a reminder to be courteous. Okay, you're going to have to elaborate on that one for me. Courteous? She folded her arms and leaned back against the counter. Well, I suppose everyone picks occasionally, and the question becomes, what do you do after? Ah, as in tissue or pant leg. Or bottom of the chair in a movie theater. Basically, how much courtesy do you show your fellow humans? He took another sip from the mug. Deep thoughts with Devin Fox. That actually has a nice ring to it. Maybe you should have your own talk show. She laughed, and it felt really, really good. She hadn't laughed that freely or goofily since she was a kid. It took her back to her childhood with him. Her eyes sobered as he held her gaze. They had history, real history, with a foundation in laughter and all of the magical fairy dust that made children believe that anything was possible. Could she forgive him if he sold off the school and took all of that hope away from the kids who lived on the island now? She wasn't sure, and she hoped she wouldn't have to find out. So, Devin, have you been to BBA yet? The look on his face was all the answer she needed. First, his eyes opened a bit more. Then he ran his hand through his thick black hair. Please tell me you at least know where it is. He exhaled guiltily. What do you say we run by after we spend some more time with Grace? You're not going to take no for an answer on this one, are you? Probably not. He smiled, and the kernel of hope that Syndey started fanning early this morning felt like it was about to pop into a full-blown garden of optimism. She had to slow herself because she knew there was a long way to go, but she had a feeling that together they'd be able to get there. Syndey's animals were happy to see her when she and Devin stopped by to drop off Gus. She couldn't help but smile as she watched the two of them interact with her menagerie. Devin's eyes lit up with each new encounter, and the big dog's response to the horses and llamas was hilarious. He touched his noses to theirs, one by one, his ears perking with greater curiosity at each animal. His eyes darted back and forth between the llamas and the horses, as if confused as to what kind of dog they were. I think Gus is trying to figure out if these are just very tall dogs. Syndey laughed, nudging Devin with her elbow, a gesture which made her stomach flutter. His solid warmth was both comforting and thrilling. He grinned, and for a split second it seemed like maybe he felt it too. Maybe he thinks they're his long-lost cousins. Should we tell him? Nah, let him dream big, she replied with a wink. Suddenly, Gus bolted away from the bleeding goats like his tail had caught fire, and they both burst into laughter. Oh man, I didn't expect that, Devin said, wiping tears from his rich brown eyes. I guess he's not a fan of goats. Guess not. You up for a little wager? Have you forgotten who you're talking to? The smile in his eyes could have lit the sky. Okay. Which animal do you think he'll befriend next? She asked. Devin raised a brow. I say, the llama with the goofy haircut. Bold choice. I'm going with good old brown sugar, she countered. As if on cue, Sugar trotted up from her sunbathing spot on the porch. The moment Gus spotted her, he abandoned the larger animals and made a beeline for the coonhound, his tail wagging his entire body. Ha! Called it, she whooped, doing a little victory dance and turning in a circle, then stopping. Heaviness and heat weighted her limbs when she noticed the way his eyes lingered. He laughed, and did she detect a slight flush of embarrassment as he held his hands up in defeat? All right, he said. You win. What's my penalty? She put her finger to her chin and raised her eyes to the sky, pondering. You have to try to communicate with the llamas using only llama sounds. His eyes widened in mock horror. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm dead serious. She grinned, playful. Devin was fun. With a dramatic sigh that made her giggle, he turned to the nearest llama and let out a series of low, guttural noises. Bah! The animal stared at him blankly, dropped her chin, and responded with her own bizarre sound. Syndey doubled over in laughter, instinctively reaching out for Devin's arm to steady herself. Oh my God, I think you offended him. Her laughing fit subsided and she stood, realizing then how close they were. His shoulder brushed hers, sending a shiver down her spine. His gaze fell to her lips, and that crooked smile of his nearly stole her breath away. They look like old friends, he said softly, nodding towards Gus and Brown Sugar chasing each other. Old friends in love. Did he mean to say that last part? Her heart raced, and she wondered what it would be like to close the small distance between them. He cleared his throat, almost as if he'd realized the potential double meaning of what he'd just said. I guess I didn't need to worry about them together. I think it's sweet that you did, she replied, trying to school her voice. We should probably go, though. As much as Syndey would have liked to spend more time at her place, to take him inside and show him around, she wanted to get to the school while class was still in session, and he was due back at Grace's in a few hours. She went to the pump and filled another bucket of water for Gus. That should tide them all over for a few hours. Are you ready? Devin's smile faltered. For a second, Syndey thought he was going to change his mind. He grabbed his bike. Ready as I'll ever be. And Sid? Yeah? You made something really special here. Thanks, she said, his praise moving through her like molten lava, warming everything it touched, then exploding into a huge grin. And not for the first time, she found herself amazed and frightened of the impact he had on her. Chapter 10. Devin. Devin heard the saws long before he saw them. The angry sound of metal chewing wood met Syndey and him at the end of the path that led from the main road back through the woods to school. Is school in session right now? He asked as they biked ahead. I thought the kids would be off for summer break. The program only lasts a year. They don't really break for the full summer. A heaviness descended on his chest. He hadn't planned a face-to-face with the kids he was going to displace. As though reading his mind, Syndey gave him a sympathetic glance that he didn't feel he deserved. Her look was one part hope, one part genuine empathy. His neck muscles balled, and he gripped the rubber handlebars so tightly his light brown knuckles whitened. He wanted to turn around, to keep on pedaling all the way to the ferry, to get into his car, and press the pedal to the floor until he and Gus were back in his tidy little condo in Chicago. That way, he could handle all of this from a distance, minimizing the chance of sentiment clouding his judgment. He reminded himself of another lesson his trading career had taught him. Emotion and business don't mix. Hadn't he already nearly lost everything from letting his emotions drive? Though reason screamed for him to turn around, something greater drove him forward. Curiosity, perhaps? Only completed 5 years ago, Devin had never actually seen his grandfather's school. In many ways, Old Nate's lessons on sailing, reading the environment, anticipating changes, and moving decisively had helped Devin to advance in his career. One quick peek at the man's creation couldn't hurt. Could it? He wouldn't let that happen. He and Syndey rested the front tires of their bikes in the slats of a long wooden bike stand. He shook out his legs under the guise of stretching, hoping to get rid of some of the tension that mounted with each step closer to his grandfather's school. BBA was on the north end of the island, tucked on 10 lakefront acres of pine grove, away from most of the typical tourist attractions. His grandfather had built a clover-shaped complex of 3 warehouses overlooking one of the island's calmer coves. Standing in the heart of the cluster, Devin saw that each of the massive garage-like doors of the buildings were open. Inside were classrooms and workspaces where students had access to the carpentry equipment necessary to build sailboats of varying sizes and complexity. The opposing walls were also garage doors, all open onto magnificent views of Lake Huron's glistening waters, where boats from the school would eventually sail. Out on the main floor, several young people concentrated on an assortment of different tasks. They were so engrossed that none of them even noticed Syndey and him watching them. "Wow, this is a proper school," Devin said. "It is indeed. Nate would be so happy to see you here right now." Syndey smiled. A knot of sadness formed in Devin's throat. "I'm sure he would." "Come on, I'll give you the grand tour and introduce you around." Syndey motioned toward the buildings. He sighed. He definitely didn't want to meet anyone. There was even more of the old man in this space than the cabin. It took all Devin's willpower to speak, let alone step forward. A wooden eagle with an 8-foot wingspan was mounted to the left of the entrance in each building. A messenger to the Creator, his grandfather used to tell him during their nature hikes. When Devin graduated from 8th grade, his grandfather showed up with a headdress full of eagle feathers. The protected feathers were symbolic of accomplishment. At first, Devin had thought it was cool, but his excitement quickly turned to shame. Some of the other kids started hooting and making fun of him. He remembered the sudden embarrassment as he looked at his grandfather, with his long dark hair, brown skin, and ill-fitting suit. The man stood out from all of the other adults at the mostly white private school. Devin's father, a city cop, broke his back working 2 jobs to pay for Devin's tuition. Never really comfortable in the school, that experience changed the way Devin looked at his grandfather for a long time. "Hey, Sid, did you drop off some of those chocolate banana cookies?" A tall brown-skinned teen called out from a table saw where he was working on a mast. "Hey, Kirk!" Syndey waved. "Sorry, not today." Devin raised his eyebrows and Syndey smiled at him mischievously. "I usually bring a couple plates of cookies to the school on Fridays. They're kind of legend." "Banana chocolate chip cookies? That sounds amazing. If you're good, I'll add you to my distribution list." She winked at Devin. "Devin, this is Kirk, one of BBA's best and brightest. He also happens to be one of my favorite former students," she added, clearly proud. Kirk removed his protective goggles to beam at both of them. Syndey reached up and gave Kirk's cheek a playful squeeze. "Kirk, I'd like you to meet Devin, old Nate's grandson." "Wow, for real?" Kirk took off his work glove and extended his palm, then pulled Devin into a quick embrace. "Yo, I'm so sorry for your loss. I loved your grandpops. Him in this school saved my life. I had no clue what I was going to do when I graduated, but thanks to him, and Ms. St. James, of course, I learned this trade. It's a real honor to meet you, my man." Devin didn't know what to say. The knot of emotion was expanding in his throat. He just nodded. Kirk gave him a knowing look. "I get it, man. It's all still fresh. He wasn't blood, but I've caught myself wet in the eyes more than a few times in the last few weeks. Don't think there's a person here who hasn't." "I'm sure," Devin said. Kirk continued, humor lighting his eyes. "Old Nate's lessons on sailing made me realize that we're all connected to nature and to each other, and my connection is telling me that you need another hug. You mind?" Devin did mind, only because he wasn't sure if he could handle dredging up any more emotions or keep himself from weeping on the teen's shoulder. But he opened his arms to the young man anyway. They hugged again. This time, the teen gave Devin something of a bear hug. When they separated, Kirk had big, fat tears in his eyes that he made no effort to conceal. Devin admired his openness, but he was still far more comfortable with the kid crying than he would have been if moisture formed in his own eyes. "Thanks, man." Devin patted the kid's shoulder. It means a lot to see how much love the community had for him. That we did. But he loved us first and he loved us best. That was just his way. It's all good, though. Now he lives through you. He stifled a groan. Kirk's words were like a gut punch. Devin's eyes were already moist, and Kirk was going to reduce him to a water bag. Right now. Right here. He rubbed his forehead and dropped his hand to his side. Coming here was a mistake. Closing this school was going to be that much harder after meeting the people impacted by his decision. How'd he let Syndey talk him into this? He glanced at the open garage door and his bike out on the rack. It would be rude to walk out on these introductions. But what did he owe any of these people really? As though sensing his unease, Syndey slipped her hand into his. It was warm and small, but her grip was firm, and it sent a strong pulse of passion radiating over his palm, up his arm, and in all directions through his body. He looked down at her. She gave him a tender smile that made him want to pull her into his arms and never let go. No, he couldn't walk out on her. Not right now, at least. "Come on, Dee, there's something else I want to show you." She tugged him lightly in the direction of a massive hull. He half smiled, so they were back to childhood nicknames. He could get with that. "It was good to meet you, Kirk," he managed as they moved off. Kirk nodded. "You too, man. You too." Close up, the hull was even bigger than it had looked when they first walked into the building. End to end, Devin guessed it was 30 feet. 2 teens were sanding the edges of the boat. A third was nailing into the deck. "What do you think?" Syndey asked. "Beautiful. Looks like it'll be sea-ready in no time." At the sound of their voices, the teens paused their work to take them in. Recognizing Syndey, their faces erupted into smiles, and they stopped what they were doing altogether to greet her. "Hey, Miss St. James." "More former students?" Devin asked. "These 2 are. This one is a beloved tag-along." Syndey pointed to the one on the deck. "You came to check out our tribute to the chief?" The girl up on deck called down. She should be ready just in time for the 4th of July boat parade. We've only got a few more things left to do on her. "Yeah, like come up with a name," one of the teens said. "We want something good, something that would make Nate proud." "I think he's proud all right," Syndey said. "Well, if the name is good enough, we won't have to guess. Speaking of guessing at names, you going to introduce us to your friend, Teach?" The teen standing closest asked Syndey. Syndey made her introductions, and Devin didn't hear a word after that. His circuits were as close to overload as they'd been in a long time. This boat was a tribute to his grandfather? Hundreds of people had come up to him last week at the funeral, but none of that had been as impactful as being in his grandfather's school. It wasn't even just the fact that the man's blood, sweat, and tears had touched the wood and the walls all around him. Nor was it the fact that all of these students spoke of him with so much love. It was something bigger than him, his grandfather, and all of the students in the school put together. Something he couldn't name at that moment. Devin looked at his watch. "Look, it was nice to meet everyone. I just remembered that I have a business call I've got to make, so I'm gonna run." If they said goodbye, he didn't hear. All he knew was that he had to get away far and fast. At the bike rack, he paused. Boy, he missed his car. Right now, he could really use a metal layer between him and the world. Syndey's arm brushed against his, and warmth flooded his chest. Well, he was grateful no metal layer had prevented that. She swung her leg over her bike and started to ride back up the path. For a minute, he just stared at her. God, she was beautiful. "You coming?" I know the perfect place for you to go to make that phone call of yours." She'd arched her right eyebrow, and he knew she was calling his bluff. "Nah, I don't think so," he said as he climbed on his bike. He needed a break from her unwavering idealism. But like a moth to a flame, when they got to the end of the road, he followed her anyway.